They called her monster. Small-town bullies ruin girls' life, but her revenge will leave you speechless. The Appalachian spring of 1948 was a hesitant one, the chill lingering in the hollers of West Virginia long after the calendar claimed it should be warm. For Isabella and Richard Aldridge, the cold seemed to mirror the fear that had taken root in their hearts. They lived on a small, struggling farm outside the town of Havenwood, a place where generations had scratched a living from the rocky soil. Isabella, barely 20, was round with her first child, a child they'd both longed for. Richard, a few years older, worked tirelessly in the nearby coal mine, his days filled with the dust and danger that were the price of survival in Havenwood. The birth was long and difficult. Old Mrs. Henderson, the midwife, her face etched with the wisdom of countless deliveries, finally held up the small, wailing bundle. "It's a girl, Isabella," she said, her voice soft. But Isabella could sense a tremor of unease. She reached for her daughter, her heart overflowing with the fierce, instinctive love of a new mother. But as she unwrapped the blanket, her breath caught in her throat. A large, port wine-stained birthmark covered most of the left side of the baby's face, stretching from her temple down to her jaw. It was a deep, purplish red, a stark contrast to the baby's otherwise pale skin. Isabella stared at it, her initial joy replaced by a wave of confusion and, she hated to admit, a flicker of fear. Richard came in, his face grimy with coal dust, his eyes shining with anticipation. He saw the baby, saw the birthmark, and his smile faltered. He looked at Isabella, then at Mrs. Henderson, his silence speaking volumes. It's just a mark, Richard," Isabella said, trying to sound reassuring, but her voice trembled. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat. "It's a birthmark, yes. A port wine stain. They're harmless, mostly. But well, folks around here can be superstitious." Superstitious. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken fears. Havenwood was a close-knit community, but it was also a place where old beliefs died hard. A place where anything different was viewed with suspicion, even fear. The next few days were a blur of whispered conversations, anxious glances, and growing dread. Richard, usually a man of quiet strength, became withdrawn and distant. He avoided looking at the baby, at the mark that seemed to brand her as different, as other. Isabella tried to be strong, to love her daughter fiercely enough to make up for the world's judgment, but the fear was a constant companion. One evening, as the shadows lengthened across the valley, Richard spoke, his voice low and strained. "We can't keep her, Isabella." Isabella's heart felt like it had been ripped from her chest. "What?" "Richard, she's our baby. She'll never have a life here," he said, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. They'll shun her. They'll call her names. She'll be an outcast." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "It's for her own good." The argument raged for hours, a desperate, heartbreaking battle between a mother's love and a father's fear. In the end, fear won. Under the cover of darkness, Richard carried the sleeping baby, wrapped in a worn quilt, to the edge of town. He left her near the small, one-room church, hoping that someone would find her, someone kinder than they had been. He left a small, silver locket with the baby, a locket that had belonged to his mother. It was all he could bear to give. He walked back to the farm, his heart heavy with a grief he knew would never leave him. Isabella didn't speak. She simply stared out the window at the rising sun, her face pale and drawn. The sun was fully up when Rose Miller found the baby. Rose was a widow, her own children grown and gone. She lived a simple life, tending her small garden and taking in sewing to make ends meet. She was known for her kindness and her quiet strength. She'd been on her way to the church for morning prayers when she heard a faint cry. She followed the sound and found the baby, nestled in the quilt. She saw the birthmark, but it didn't fill her with fear. It filled her with compassion. She picked up the baby, cradling her close. "Well, now, little one," she murmured, her voice soft and soothing. "What are you doing here all alone?" She looked around, but there was no one in sight. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this baby had been abandoned. And she knew, just as surely, that she couldn't leave her there. "I'll call you Lucy," she said, smiling down at the baby. "Lucy's a good name, a strong name." She carried the baby home, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and a quiet, unexpected joy. A new chapter had begun for both of them. Rose Miller's cottage was small, but it was filled with warmth and the scent of baking bread. It sat on the outskirts of Havenwood, surrounded by a riot of wildflowers in the summer and a blanket of pristine snow in the winter. For Lucy, it was the only home she'd ever known, and Rose was the only mother she'd ever needed. Rose was a practical woman, but she had a deep well of tenderness. She never hid Lucy's birthmark, nor did she make a fuss about it. She simply treated it as a part of who Lucy was, like her bright blue eyes and her unruly, dark curls. She taught Lucy to read and write, to sew and garden, and to find beauty in the simple things, the flight of a hummingbird, the scent of honeysuckle, the warmth of the sun on her face. Lucy's early childhood was filled with these simple joys. She spent hours exploring the woods behind the cottage, building forts of fallen branches and imagining herself as a brave adventurer. She helped Rose in the garden, her small hands digging in the rich soil. She listened, wide-eyed, as Rose told stories of her own childhood, stories of resilience and overcoming hardship. But even in this idyllic setting, shadows began to creep in. As Lucy grew older, she became aware that she was different. When she went into town with Rose, she noticed the way people stared. Some looked away quickly, their faces filled with discomfort. Others whispered behind their hands, their words like tiny, stinging insects. The first overt sign of trouble came when Lucy was about 6 years old. Rose had taken her to the annual Havenwood picnic, the gathering of the entire community. Lucy was excited, dressed in a new dress Rose had sewn for her hair tied back with a bright ribbon. She was playing with some of the other children, running and laughing, when a boy, a few years older than her, pointed at her face. "Look at the monster," he shouted. "She's got a purple face." Other children joined in, their laughter turning cruel. Lucy froze, her cheeks burning with shame. She looked to Rose for help, her eyes brimming with tears. Rose, her face tight with anger, gathered Lucy in her arms and led her away from the taunting crowd. "Don't you pay them any mind, Lucy," Rose said, her voice firm but gentle. "They're just ignorant. They don't understand." But Lucy did understand. She understood that her birthmark made her different, and that difference made her a target. That boy, the one who had first shouted, was Anthony Aldridge. He wasn't a close relative, a second cousin, twice removed, or something of that sort, to Isabella and Richard. He was a few years older than Lucy, and he seemed to take a particular delight in tormenting her. He wasn't physically violent, but his words were sharp and his constant presence was a reminder of her otherness. Anthony wasn't inherently evil. He was more a product of the town's ingrained prejudices. A boy who learned to be cruel by mimicking the adults around him. He held no real power, but he represented the pervasive attitude of Havenwood. As Lucy got older, the whispers and stares became more frequent, the taunts more pointed. Rose tried her best to shield Lucy, to instill in her a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on the opinions of others. But it was a losing battle. The prejudice of Havenwood was a heavy weight, slowly crushing Lucy's spirit. Lucy's first day of school was a microcosm of the life that awaited her in Havenwood. Rose had walked her to the small, one-room schoolhouse, her hand firmly clasped in Lucy's. Lucy, clutching a worn slate and a piece of chalk, felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She loved learning, and the prospect of being with other children, of making friends, filled her with a hesitant hope. That hope quickly evaporated. The schoolteacher, Miss Abigail, was a kind woman, but she was also a product of Havenwood. She greeted Lucy with a forced smile, her eyes lingering for a moment too long on the birthmark. The other children, already seated at their desks, stared openly. Some giggled, others whispered, and a few, emboldened by Anthony Aldridge's presence, pointed and made faces. Lucy, trying to ignore the stares, took a seat at an empty desk near the back of the room. Miss Abigail began the lesson, but Lucy found it difficult to concentrate. The whispers followed her, like a swarm of bees buzzing around her head. "Look at her face. It's like a bruise. My mama says she's cursed." During recess, Lucy tried to join a group of girls playing jump rope. They stopped their game as she approached, their faces turning cold. "You can't play with us," one of them said, her voice laced with disdain. "You're different." Anthony Aldridge, standing nearby, smirked. "Yeah, go play with the monsters, purple face." Lucy's eyes welled up with tears, but she refused to cry in front of them. She turned and ran to the far corner of the schoolyard, hiding behind a large oak tree. She spent the rest of recess alone, her heart aching with loneliness and rejection. This pattern repeated itself day after day. Lucy excelled in her studies, her quick mind grasping concepts easily. But the social isolation was relentless. She was always the last one chosen for teams, the one left out of games, the one whispered about in the hallways. Rose tried to counteract the negativity. She spent hours reading to Lucy, encouraging her love of learning. She taught her practical skills, like sewing and gardening, emphasizing the value of self-sufficiency. She told her stories of strong women who had overcome adversity, hoping to instill in Lucy a sense of her own inner strength. "The world can be a cruel place, Lucy," Rose said one evening as they sat by the fire, "but you mustn't let it break you. You have a good heart and a strong mind. That's all you need." But even Rose's unwavering love couldn't completely erase the sting of rejection. Lucy began to withdraw, becoming quieter and more reserved. The joy that had once filled her eyes was replaced by a shadow of sadness. She started to dread going to school, her stomach churning with anxiety each morning. The whispers weren't confined to the schoolyard. They followed Lucy everywhere she went in Havenwood. At the general store, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Gable, would often serve her last, her face a mask of disapproval. At church, people would avoid sitting near her, their gazes sliding away from her birthmark. Lucy began to internalize the prejudice, to believe that she was somehow flawed and worthy of kindness and acceptance. The birthmark, once just a part of her, became a symbol of her shame, a constant reminder that she didn't belong. Anthony Aldridge, while not the sole source of Lucy's suffering, became a focal point for the town's prejudice. He wasn't a powerful figure in Havenwood. He was just a boy, a few years older than Lucy, but he possessed a certain charisma, a knack for influencing others, especially those younger than him. He was the kind of boy who could make cruelty seem cool, who could turn a whisper into a shout. Anthony's influence wasn't based on any real authority. He wasn't particularly wealthy or well-connected. His family, like most in Havenwood, scraped by on hard work and meager earnings. But he had a sharp tongue and a keen eye for weakness. He understood, instinctively, the power of social pressure, and he used it to his advantage. He didn't overtly threaten Lucy, nor did he physically harm her. His methods were more subtle, more insidious. He would make snide remarks in the schoolyard, loud enough for everyone to hear. He would organize games and deliberately exclude Lucy. He would spread rumors, whispers about her being cursed or touched by the devil, playing on the superstitions that still lingered in Havenwood. His influence extended beyond the schoolyard. He would often be seen loitering near the general store when Lucy and Rose went shopping, making pointed comments about Lucy's appearance. He would lead groups of children in taunting songs as Lucy walked home from school. He made it his mission to ensure that Lucy was never allowed to forget her place in Havenwood, an outcast, an object of ridicule. One particularly cruel incident occurred during the annual Havenwood Harvest Festival. Lucy, despite her usual reluctance to attend public events, had been persuaded by Rose to go. Rose had made her a new dress, a pretty blue one that made Lucy feel, for a moment, almost normal. Lucy was watching the pie eating contest, a small smile on her face, when Anthony approached her. He was holding a half-eaten apple, its core stained red. "Hey, purple face," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Want an apple? It matches your face." He held the apple out to her, his eyes glinting with malice. A group of children gathered around, snickering. Lucy felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the ground. Before she could react, a young woman, Sarah Miller, no relation to Rose, who was visiting from a neighboring town, stepped forward. Sarah had seen the exchange, and her face was flushed with anger. "Leave her alone, Anthony," she said, her voice sharp. "You're being cruel." Anthony, surprised by the intervention, mumbled something and backed away, his audience dispersing. Sarah turned to Lucy, her expression softening. "Don't listen to him," she said gently. "He's just a bully." Lucy, unable to speak, simply nodded, her eyes filled with tears. Sarah's kindness was a brief respite, a moment of grace in a sea of cruelty. But it also highlighted the reality of her situation. She needed someone to defend her, because she couldn't defend herself against the pervasive prejudice of Havenwood. This incident, and others like it, solidified Anthony's role as the embodiment of Havenwood's rejection. He wasn't the cause of it, but he was the instrument, the amplifier, the constant reminder of Lucy's outsider status. His influence, while not absolute, was a significant factor in Lucy's growing despair. As Lucy entered her teenage years, a new shadow fell upon their lives: Rose's declining health. The years of hard work and simple living had taken their toll. What started as a persistent cough gradually worsened, leaving Rose breathless and weak. The vibrant energy that had always characterized her began to fade, replaced by a fragility that frightened Lucy. Rose tried to hide her illness, to maintain her usual routine, but it became increasingly difficult. She could no longer spend long hours in the garden, her hands, once so skilled at coaxing life from the soil, now trembling with weakness. The sewing that had provided their meager income became sporadic, then ceased altogether. Lucy, sensing Rose's vulnerability, took on more and more responsibility. She cooked the meals, cleaned the cottage, and tended the small garden as best she could. She tried to be strong, to be the caregiver Rose had always been for her, but the fear was a constant companion. The thought of losing Rose, the only person who had ever truly loved her, was unbearable. The doctor, a kindly old man named Dr. Abernathy, visited Rose regularly, but there was little he could do. He diagnosed her with a weakness of the lungs, a vague term that encompassed a range of ailments common in the Appalachian region, often exacerbated by poor nutrition and harsh living conditions. He prescribed tonics and rest, but he knew, and Lucy suspected, that Rose's condition was irreversible. The financial strain added to their burden. The money Rose had saved over the years dwindled rapidly, spent on doctors' visits and medicines that offered little relief. Lucy tried to find work, but the prejudice of Havenwood followed her. No one wanted to hire the marked girl. She was met with pitying glances, outright refusals, or worse, offers of demeaning work for insultingly low wages. One evening, as Lucy was helping Rose to bed, Rose coughed violently, her frail body racked with spasms. When the coughing subsided, Rose looked at Lucy, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Lucy," she said, her voice weak and raspy, "I'm not going to be around much longer." Lucy tried to deny it, to reassure Rose, but the words caught in her throat. She knew it was true. "I want you to be strong, Lucy," Rose continued. "You have a good heart and a strong spirit. Don't let this town, don't let them break you." She reached out and took Lucy's hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Promise me you'll find a better life," she said. "Promise me you'll leave this place and find somewhere you can be happy." Lucy, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "I promise, Rose. I promise." That promise became Lucy's driving force. It was a promise made not only to Rose, but to herself. It was a promise to escape the suffocating prejudice of Havenwood and find a place where she could finally breathe free. But with Rose's decline, the weight of that promise felt heavier than ever. She was trapped between her love for Rose and her desperate need to escape. Rose's death, when it finally came, was peaceful. She passed away in her sleep, her hand clasped in Lucy's. The grief that washed over Lucy was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sorrow that threatened to drown her. Rose had been her anchor, her protector, her only family. Now, she was truly alone. The funeral was a small, sparsely attended affair. A few of Rose's older friends came, offering their condolences, but the majority of Havenwood stayed away. The whispers followed Lucy even to the graveside, whispers about the marked girl, who was now truly alone. Anthony Aldridge, standing at the edge of the small crowd, watched with a smug expression. After the funeral, Lucy returned to the empty cottage, the silence deafening. The scent of Rose's lavender soap still lingered in the air, a constant reminder of her loss. Lucy wandered from room to room, touching Rose's belongings, her worn sewing basket, her favorite teacup, the faded quilt on her bed. Each object was a sharp pang of grief. The practical realities of her situation quickly set in. With Rose gone, there was no income. The small savings they had were depleted, and Lucy had no way to earn a living in Havenwood. The prejudice that had always been a barrier now became an insurmountable wall. She tried to find work, any work. She offered to clean houses, to do laundry, to help in the fields. But she was met with rejection at every turn. Mrs. Gable, the shopkeeper, refused to extend her any credit, making it impossible for Lucy to even buy food. "I can't keep giving handouts to the likes of you, Mrs. Gable said, her voice cold. "You need to learn to fend for yourself." Lucy, desperate, offered to work in exchange for food, but Mrs. Gable simply shook her head. The ostracism extended beyond the practical. People avoided her on the street, crossing to the other side to avoid passing her. Children pointed and whispered. The sense of isolation was crushing. Lucy felt like she was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a town that had no place for her. She spent her days wandering the woods, seeking solace in the natural world that had always been a source of comfort. She would sit by the creek where she and Rose had often picnicked, the sound of the rushing water a temporary balm for her aching heart. But even the beauty of nature couldn't fully erase the pain of her loneliness and rejection. She began to lose weight, her already slender frame becoming gaunt. The lack of food, combined with the constant stress, took its toll. She felt weak and exhausted, her spirits slowly eroding. The promise she had made to Rose to find a better life seemed increasingly distant, an impossible dream. The breaking point came on a cold, gray day in late autumn. Lucy, driven by hunger, had gone to the back door of the Havenwood bakery, hoping to beg for scraps. The baker, a man named Mr. Henderson, no relation to the midwife, had occasionally given Rose leftover bread in the past. Lucy knocked timidly on the door. Mr. Henderson opened it, his face hardening when he saw her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Please, Mr. Henderson," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. Do you have any scraps? Anything you could spare?" Mr. Henderson looked at her, his expression a mixture of pity and disgust. "I can't help you," he said. "I have a business to run, and frankly, people don't want your kind around the food." Before Lucy could respond, Anthony Aldridge appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. He was carrying a sack of flour, presumably delivering it to the bakery. Well, he said, smirking. "Look who it is. Begging for scraps, are we?" He turned to Mr. Henderson. "Don't give her anything. She's cursed. She'll bring bad luck to your business." Mr. Henderson, influenced by Anthony's words and the pervasive prejudice of the town, hesitated. He looked at Lucy, then back at Anthony. I'm sorry," he said to Lucy, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't help you." He closed the door, leaving Lucy standing there, alone and humiliated. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally overflowed. She sank to the ground, her body shaking with sobs. It wasn't just the hunger, it was the cumulative weight of years of rejection, of being treated as less than human. It was the realization that she had no place in Havenwood, that she would never be accepted, never be allowed to live a normal life. In that moment, something inside Lucy snapped. The despair that had been gnawing at her for so long gave way to a surge of anger, and then, to a steely resolve. She would not stay in Havenwood and starve. She would not let them break her. She would keep her promise to Rose. She stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She looked back at the bakery, at the town that had rejected her, and a fierce determination filled her heart. She would leave. She would go to New York City. She had heard stories of the city, of its vastness, its anonymity, its opportunities. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance she had. She returned to the cottage, her mind racing. She had very little to pack: a few items of Rose's clothing, the silver locket Richard had left with her as a baby, a small, worn Bible that Rose had read to her from. She had no money, no food, no idea how she would get to New York. But she had something more important. She had the will to survive. Lucy left Havenwood under the cover of darkness, just as she had been brought into the world. She walked along the dirt road that led out of town, her few belongings bundled in a worn shawl. She had no map, no plan, only a vague sense of direction north, towards the city she had only dreamed of. Her first challenge was simply getting out of the Appalachian foothills. She walked for days, sleeping in barns and haylofts when she could, foraging for berries and edible plants when she was lucky. She avoided the main roads, fearing that someone from Havenwood might recognize her and try to bring her back. She eventually reached a larger town, a place where she could blend in with the crowds. She learned that the best way to travel long distances was by hitchhiking, a risky proposition for a young woman alone, but Lucy was desperate. She stood by the side of the highway, her thumb outstretched, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Many cars passed her by, their drivers eyeing her with suspicion. But finally, a truck driver, a grizzled man with a kind face, stopped. "Where you headed, girl?" he asked. "New York City," Lucy said, her voice surprisingly steady. The driver looked at her for a moment, then shrugged. "Hop in. I'm going that way." The ride was long and bumpy, but Lucy didn't complain. She was grateful for the lift, for the chance to put some distance between herself and Havenwood. The truck driver, whose name was Joe, didn't ask many questions. He seemed to understand that Lucy was running from something, and he respected her silence. Joe dropped her off on the outskirts of a larger city, still hundreds of miles from New York. He gave her a few dollars and a sandwich, a gesture of kindness that brought tears to Lucy's eyes. "Good luck, kid," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "You'll need it." Lucy continued her journey, hitchhiking with a series of drivers, each one a different story, a different glimpse into the vastness of America. She encountered kindness and cruelty, generosity and suspicion. She learned to be wary, to trust her instincts, to protect herself. She slept in bus stations, in parks, in abandoned buildings. She ate whatever she could find, often going hungry for days at a time. The journey was arduous, physically and emotionally draining, but she never gave up. The thought of New York, of a new life, kept her going. After weeks of travel, she finally reached the outskirts of the city. The skyline, a jagged silhouette against the horizon, filled her with a mixture of awe and trepidation. It was a world unlike anything she had ever known, a place of immense possibility and unknown dangers. She walked the final miles, her legs aching, her feet blistered, her heart pounding with anticipation. As she entered the city, the noise and the crowds were overwhelming, a sensory overload after the quiet solitude of her journey. But amidst the chaos, she felt a flicker of hope. She was here. She had made it. She had escaped. New York City in the late 1960s was a whirlwind of activity, a melting pot of cultures and experiences. For Lucy, arriving with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of hope, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. The sheer scale of the city, the towering buildings, the constant noise, the endless stream of people, it was a world away from the quiet, rural life she had known in Havenwood. Her first priority was finding a place to stay. She quickly learned that the city was expensive, and her meager savings, what little she had managed to earn from odd jobs during her journey, wouldn't last long. She found a cheap room in a rundown boarding house in a lower Manhattan neighborhood, a place filled with other newcomers, all struggling to find their footing in the city. Finding work was equally challenging. Her lack of experience and her birthmark, while less of a stigma in the diverse city than it had been in Havenwood, still made it difficult to find employment. She was turned down for countless jobs, waitressing, factory work, cleaning positions. But Lucy was persistent. She had learned resilience from Rose, and she refused to be defeated. She finally found a job as a dishwasher in a small, family-owned diner in Greenwich Village. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay low, but it was enough to keep her afloat. The diner's owners, a Greek couple named Maria and Dimitri, were kind to Lucy. They saw her quiet determination, her willingness to work hard, and they gave her a chance. They didn't ask about her past, and they didn't judge her for her birthmark. Lucy slowly began to build a new life. She made a few friends at the boarding house, other young women who had come to the city seeking a fresh start. They shared stories, offered support, and formed a makeshift family. She discovered the public library, a haven of peace and knowledge in the bustling city. She spent hours there reading books, losing herself in stories, educating herself. She had always loved learning, and the library became her sanctuary. She also began to explore the city, walking for miles, discovering hidden parks, vibrant neighborhoods, and a sense of freedom she had never known before. In New York, she was anonymous, just another face in the crowd. Her birthmark, while still noticeable, didn't define her. She could be whoever she wanted to be, but the challenges remained. The city was a tough place, and Lucy faced her share of setbacks. She was robbed once, losing what little money she had. She dealt with loneliness and homesickness, the constant ache of missing Rose. There were times when she felt overwhelmed, when she doubted her ability to survive. But she persevered. She learned to navigate the city's complexities, to be street smart, to protect herself. She held onto the hope that had brought her to New York, the belief that she could build a better life. Years passed. Lucy's life in New York City settled into a rhythm. She moved out of the boarding house and into a small apartment, a tiny space but her own. She left the diner job and found work as a seamstress, her skills honed by years of sewing with Rose proving invaluable. She wasn't rich, but she was self-sufficient, able to provide for herself. She never forgot Rose, or the promise she had made. She carried Rose's memory with her, a source of strength and inspiration. She also carried the scars of her past, the emotional wounds of rejection and abandonment. But she learned to live with them, to integrate them into her story. She found a sense of community in her neighborhood, connecting with other women who had faced their own challenges. She joined a sewing circle, sharing her skills and her stories. She volunteered at a local homeless shelter, offering a helping hand to those who were struggling, just as she had once struggled. She never married, never had children of her own. But she found love in other ways, in the friendships she forged, and the community she built, and the quiet satisfaction of helping others. She realized that family wasn't just about blood relations, it was about connection, about shared experiences, about mutual support. One day, many years after arriving in New York, Lucy received a letter. It was from a lawyer in West Virginia. The letter informed her that Anthony Aldridge had passed away. He had, surprisingly, left her a small inheritance, a portion of the Aldridge family farm, the very land that Isabella and Richard had owned. Lucy was stunned. She had never expected anything from the Aldridges, certainly not from Anthony. She considered ignoring the letter, dismissing it as a cruel joke. But curiosity, and a sense of unfinished business, compelled her to respond. She traveled back to Havenwood, for the first time since she had fled all those years ago. The town had changed, but not entirely. The mountains still stood sentinel, the air still smelled of pine and earth. But the atmosphere felt different, less oppressive. She met with the lawyer, a young woman who had no connection to the old families of Havenwood. The lawyer explained that Anthony, in his later years, had expressed regret for his past actions. He had never married, had lived a solitary life, and had apparently come to realize the harm he had caused. The inheritance was his attempt at making amends. Lucy visited the Aldridge farm. It was run down, neglected, but the land itself was beautiful, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. She walked the fields, remembering the stories Rose had told her about her own parents, about their dreams of a better life. She decided to sell the farm. She had no desire to live in Havenwood, to return to the place that had caused her so much pain. But she used the money from the sale to create a small foundation, a fund to help young people in similar situations, those who had been marginalized, rejected, or abandoned. She named the foundation after Rose. Lucy returned to New York City, to her apartment, to her friends, to her community. She had found peace, not in forgetting her past, but in accepting it, in learning from it, in using it to create a better future. She had found her purpose, not in grand achievements, but in the small acts of kindness, in the quiet strength of resilience, and in unwavering belief in the possibility of a better life. She had kept her promise.